This provides further evidence that the Al-Khifa Refugee Center was in fact a CIA operation. If Hekmat Jar was the CIA's #1 guy in Afghanistan, and the Al-Khifa Refugee Center was sending him recruits, isn't it likely that the Al-Khifa Refugee Center was also a CIA operation? And in fact, according to Newsweek, the Al-Khifa Refugee Center in Brooklyn was run by the CIA. This is how they described it. The diaspora of young Arab men willing to die for Allah congregated at the Al-Khifa Refugee Center in Brooklyn, New York, a dreary inner-city building that doubled as a recruiting post for the CIA. Furthermore, Newsweek says that the CIA provided passports to many of the Mujahideen so they could come to the Al-Khifa Refugee Center in Brooklyn after the war. This CIA document shows that Azam met with Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. Azam knew bin Laden's family and that bin Laden had significant sums of disposable income. Azam convinced bin Laden that he, bin Laden, had the ability to create a network that could significantly enhance Mujahideen abilities to recruit fighters and obtain contributions from around the Islamic world for the war effort. Shortly thereafter, bin Laden joined Azam in Peshawar, and they formed the Maktab al-Khidmat. In English, the phrase Maktab al-Khidmat means the Office of Services. Instead of saying the full name of Azam's organization, the Office of Services to the Holy Warriors, people often shorten the names of the Office of Services, or Maktab al-Khidmat in Arabic. The important thing to note here is that the organization referenced in this CIA document is the same organization that Stephen Emerson is talking about. And remember that this organization is also known as the Al-Khifa Refugee Center. We can probably forgive Emerson for not mentioning that Osama bin Laden co-founded the Al-Khifa Refugee Center, as this video was aired in 1994, before most people knew who Osama bin Laden was. But the history of bin Laden in Afghanistan is important. To further understand this history, let's now take a look at a book written by Ahmed Rashid. The book is called Taliban. The book, of course, deals with the history of the Taliban. The book has been translated into 22 different languages. 1,500,000 copies of the book have been sold worldwide. The book is assigned reading in 200 universities throughout America and Britain. Chapter 10 of the book is called Global Jihad, the Arab Afghans and Osama bin Laden. The chapter contains the history of what Osama bin Laden did in Afghanistan during the 80s. Osama bin Laden went to Afghanistan to fight the Soviets. He is the son of Mohammed bin Laden, a Yemeni who emigrated to Saudi Arabia. While living in Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Laden founded a construction company, which is today known as the Saudi bin Laden Group, the largest construction company in the world. Mohammed bin Laden was a close friend of the late King Faisal of Saudi Arabia. Apparently, being friends with the Saudi royal family has its benefits. Bin Laden was able to become fabulously wealthy on the contract to renovate and expand the holy mosques of Mecca and Medina. His son, Osama bin Laden, played an important role in the war against the Soviets in Afghanistan. He led the Saudi contingent in Afghanistan. Pakistani intelligence wanted a Saudi royal prince to lead the Saudi contingent in Afghanistan. But no pampered Saudi prince was ready to rough it out in the Afghan mountains. Bin Laden, although not a royal, was close enough to the royals and certainly wealthy enough to lead the Saudi contingent. The fact that his family ran the largest construction company in the world came in handy. He was able to use personnel and equipment from the Saudi bin Laden group to build roads and depots for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. In 1986, he helped build the Coast Tunnel Complex, which the CIA was funding as a major arms storage depot, training facility, and medical center for the Mujahideen. Osama bin Laden once told Ahmed Rashid that volunteers were trained by Pakistani and American officers at his training camps. He also told Rashid that the weapons were supplied by the Americans, the money by the Saudis. I mentioned these stories of CIA collaboration with Osama bin Laden because I have sometimes heard people falsely argue that the actions of Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan were somehow separate or independent from the actions of the CIA. These stories show that Osama bin Laden was in fact working closely with the CIA to defeat the Soviets. In addition to not liking the Soviets, apparently, Abdullah Azzam didn't like America either.
The world today is arbitrarily ruled by Jews and Christians. The Americans, the British, and others. And behind them, the fingers of international Jewry with their wealth and their women and their media.
Abdullah Azzam was the keynote speaker at what was called the First Conference of Jihad, held not in the Middle East, but in Brooklyn, New York. Azzam instructed his audience to wage jihad wherever they were, even in America.
The jihad, the fighting, is obligatory on you wherever you can perform it. And just as when you are in America you must fast unless you are ill or on a voyage, so too must you wage jihad.
As you can see from the video, Emerson is showing Masjid al-Farouk as the place where the first conference of Jihad took place. The CIA knew about what was going on at the mosque and must have had it under surveillance. Perhaps the CIA didn't like what Azzam said about jihad in America because the following year he was killed. The killers have still not been identified, which in my mind makes it likely that they were working for a Western government. The death of Azzam, however, did not end the Al-Khifa Refugee Center, though it did result in a name change. According to Rashid, after the Soviets left Afghanistan, the Maktab would emerge at the center of a web of radical organizations that helped carry out the World Trade Center bombing and the bombings of the U.S. embassies in Africa in 1998. In other words, the Office of Services, otherwise known as the Al-Khifa Refugee Center, became Al-Qaeda. Rashid explains the name change on page 132 of his book. After the death of Azzam in 1989, Osama bin Laden took over Azzam's organization and set up Al-Qaeda, or military base, as a service center for Arab Afghans and their families. Emerson never says that the Al-Khifa Refugee Center became Al-Qaeda. Again, we can forgive him for this, as the video was published in 1994, and nobody had heard of Al-Qaeda at this time. Emerson does, however, talk about the expansion of jihad from Afghanistan to other places.
Now, the enemy was no longer just the communists, but Jews, Christians, and moderate Muslims, who they accused of being part of a conspiracy to defeat Islam. Islamic holy warriors began launching terror attacks against Israel, Egypt, and Algeria. The militants' rage was not limited to their enemies in the Middle East. Increasingly, the Islamic holy warriors focused their anger on the West, especially America.
Emerson talked to an FBI agent about this worldwide terrorist network that the CIA spawned.
What is unique is the international nature, the connection all the way from North America, Europe, the Middle East, Pakistan, Afghanistan, over into Southeast Asia. It is much more global than any type of terrorist network that we've had to deal with in the past.
I find it hard to believe that these Islamic fundamentalists can sustain this network without outside support. Given that the CIA created these fundamentalists in the first place, it seems only logical that they maintain control of them after the war in Afghanistan. While the CIA takes credit for running the operation to remove the Soviets from Afghanistan, they seem to have a hard time explaining what came next. I'm not exactly sure what the official CIA story is for what happened afterwards. But it seems like their story is that they just stopped everything and forgot that the Al-Khifa Refugee Center, now Al-Qaeda, had 38 branch offices in America. So after the war in Afghanistan, what happened to those 38 Al-Khifa Refugee Centers in America?
These centers became clearinghouses and recruiting offices to support jihad around the world.
If the CIA supported the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, isn't it reasonable to suspect that they supported them when they attacked other countries as well? Here's Charles Kogan trying to explain the actions of his former assets. Notice how nervous he is.
We had really very few illusions. That's not to say that we could have predicted that some of these Mujahideen might have turned against the U.S. or the West later on. But as I say, our focus was on hitting and hurting as much as possible the Soviet forces in Afghanistan. I don't think we have really anything to be apologetic about. These were the fighting assets, and we had to aid them. What came later, came later.
Radicals conducted military exercises at shooting ranges and training camps in at least 9 U.S. locations, including this one in Connecticut. Groups of Islamic militants fired semi-automatic weapons and trained with explosives. According to FBI intelligence reports, groups would come every weekend and shoot 1,000 rounds a day into silhouette-shaped targets. One of the leaders was an Egyptian immigrant named Said Nosser.
You may be wondering why the FBI allowed those militants to reside in America and learn how to shoot things. And of course the answer is they needed to learn how to shoot before going to Afghanistan to fight the Soviets. According to the New York Times, before the people recruited at the Al-Khifa Refugee Center in Brooklyn went to Afghanistan, the recruits received training on using rifles, assault weapons, and handguns. In this article, the Times specifically mentioned Said Nosser as having received this training. Court papers showed that he received weapons training during the summer of 1989 at the High Rock shooting range in Naugatuck, Connecticut.
In November 1990, Nosser was arrested for the murder of militant Rabbi Meir Kahane. Nosser was ultimately convicted of weapons charges, but unexpectedly, the jury acquitted him of the Kahane murder. His supporters were elated.
The judge called the verdict outrageous.
It was irrational almost in terms of the evidence that I saw at that trial. It made no sense, common or otherwise, to reach that verdict, particularly with the other verdicts that were reached. So I think it was outrageous.
Presumably, the U.S. government had the jury acquit Nosser because they wanted to embolden his comrades at the Al-Khifa Refugee Center, which was by now actually Al-Qaeda. The government wanted Al-Qaeda to believe that they still supported them, and the acquittal did embolden his comrades. They would soon bomb the World Trade Center. You may be wondering, if his comrades bombed the World Trade Center, shouldn't the government have known about the plot beforehand? Shouldn't the FBI have investigated his friends and had them under surveillance? Shouldn't the CIA have been watching them? These people were the same people the CIA used to oust the Soviets from Afghanistan. The CIA knew about them. Shouldn't they have been able to prevent them from attacking the World Trade Center? Of course the FBI and the CIA could have prevented Al-Qaeda from attacking the World Trade Center. But they didn't. And so one must conclude that the U.S. government wanted them to attack the World Trade Center.
Even though Nosser had ties to an international radical network, police never investigated the possibility of a larger conspiracy.
There was no indication at all of any conspiracy of a nature that has been spoken of. The facts indicate at this point it was a lone gunman who committed a homicide.
Tonight on Minute by Minute, the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. New York City, rush hour. Millions of people trudge through snow and freezing winds. Thousands come here to the World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan. It is a city in itself. 2 of the world's tallest buildings, with 2 train stations, a hotel, mall, and more than 230 elevators, shuttling a daily population of nearly 200,000 people. One of those thousands is Carl Selinger, a manager with the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey for 24 years. This morning, he's at his desk in Tower 1.
I work on the 65th floor, had a beautiful view out towards the Statue of Liberty, so it was like home.
7 floors above, the Port Authority's chief engineer, Gene Fasulo, is in his office on the 72nd floor.
My role was basically to run the engineering function at the Port Authority. It was really a very busy day.
Port Authority attorney Kathleen Collins enters her office on the 66th floor. 9 a.m. Thousands of other commuters stream out of the center's bustling train stations and into their offices. The Trade Center now teems with workers and visitors equaling the population of the entire city of Laredo, Texas. 10:10 a.m. A class of kindergartners makes its way through the huge glass revolving doors of Tower 2. They've come from Brooklyn on a field trip with their teacher, Rosemarie Russo.
I had 14 children that day. We're going to observation deck upstairs to get a bird's eye view of New York.
56 miles away, across the Hudson River, stock trader Tim Lang starts up his Toyota 4Runner for the trip to his office in New York City. It was a trip he did not want to make.
My partner called me that morning and asked me to come in that day. But I didn't see the point, and he eventually came around to convince me to come in.
11:15 a.m. 3 other men are also heading toward the World Trade Center. Iyad Ismail and Ramzi Youssef are driving a 10-foot yellow Ryder van. Following them is a car driven by Mohammed Salame. The FBI has a file on Salame. He is a known associate of reputed Islamic terrorists. Salame had leased the van from a Ryder rental agency in Jersey City 3 days earlier and reported it stolen just yesterday. It now carries a 1,500-pound bomb made of urea nitrate and hydrogen. 11:55 a.m. The yellow Ryder van pulls into level B2 of the World Trade Center garage. Iyad Ismail steers it to an illegal parking space. Mohammed Salame follows behind. Rosemarie Russo starts rounding up her 5-year-old sightseers on the Trade Center observation deck. Tim Lang pulls into the center's garage, 4 blocks from his office. In the Ryder van, Ramzi Youssef readies a fuse attached to the 1,500-pound bomb. On the 65th floor, manager Carl Sellinger leaves to get some lunch before his next appointment.
Well, the Port Authority has a cafeteria on the 43rd floor. I figured that, well, let me go get some salad to bring back to my desk because I really wanted to prepare for this meeting.
Gene Fasulo and 2 co-workers decide to go downstairs.
So we were actually on our way to lunch, and we were going to catch up on the events of the last week or so.
On the B2 level, Ramzi Youssef lights a fuse on the bomb. The fuse is encased in rubber, which suppresses smoke and allows for a 10 to 20-minute burn time. 150 feet away, the center's supervising engineer, Alan Reese, heads down the hallway to his office.
I was going downstairs to the office to see some friends and just talk about what we're going to do this weekend and how things were going.
2 floors below, on B4, engineer Fred Furby finishes a job and tells his co-worker, Richie Walsh, to go upstairs to turn in their worksheets.
I was telling him to go take the paperwork, turn it in, so they don't come down and bother us, you know? And I just was so insistent on it, so he wouldn't turn it in.
12:05 p.m. Youssef and Ismail jump into Salome's car and speed out of the garage. 12:10 p.m. The fuse on the bomb has been burning for 6 minutes. Off-duty Port Authority detective Thomas McHale reads a newspaper on the Trade Center's concourse level as he waits for a train to New Jersey. McHale happens to be in the building for a doctor's appointment following a work-related injury.
The morning I was actually off duty. I injured my ankle, line of duty injury in the subway.
Stock trader Tim Lang has found a parking spot. It's on the same level as the Ryder van, where the fuse has now been burning for 11 minutes. It's 12:17 p.m.
I'd gotten into the elevator and pressed 65.
I'm approached by an individual who asks for directions to the Newark train.
We're waiting now for the elevator to come for us.
I was standing within the door frame and had just opened the door to my office.
We entered an elevator on the 72nd floor.
I was cutting insulation, you know, putting it on the cart.
I was in my office, and my friend was coming up, and we were going to have pizza.
I got out of the car, opened the backseat door, reached for my things, had my car keys in my hand.
The rental van detonates with a force equivalent to 800 pounds of TNT, tearing through 11-inch concrete floors in the bowels of America's famous landmark.
I was physically lifted up into the air and thrown back with terrific force.
All of a sudden, just boom, something hit me, and it's like, it took my breath away. It blew me across the room.
The exterior walls of the garage came caving into the path concourse level.
On the street, car windshields as far as 300 feet away are blown apart as the wave of the blast shoots up through the buildings.
The elevator just came to emergency stop. It jiggled as it stopped quickly.
And then all of a sudden it stopped. It like shuddered and then stopped.
We were waiting to go down. The lights started flickering and the alarms started going off.
The wind is knocked out of you, but expand that to be every part of your body just being squeezed.
The smoke went up the elevator shaft and up some of the stair towers. Very shortly, it became very difficult to breathe.
I could just remember all the gray smoke just filling the whole entire area.
I put my hand in front of my face to try to see if I could see my hand, and I couldn't see anything. So my first thought was that I was blind.
Chaos and confusion confront rescuers as they try to reach Lang and thousands of others. At 12:18 in the afternoon, a 1,500-pound bomb is detonated in the underground parking garage of the World Trade Center. 12:20 p.m. New York Police Department bomb squad detective Stephen Dodge is about to go out for a quick lunch.
The phone call came in from the United States Secret Service telling us that there was a large explosion at the World Trade Center.
6 blocks from the Trade Center, while monitoring the police radio, Neil Herman, the supervisor of the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force, hears about the explosion.
At first, it was believed to be some kind of a electrical or transformer explosion.
12:26 p.m. It's a citywide alert. Within minutes, 750 firefighters and hundreds of law enforcement and emergency personnel, including Dodge, converge on the Twin Towers.
There was mass confusion. People were running out of the building, ambulances were pulling up, fire trucks were pulling up.
Police set up a command center on the street outside Tower 1.
Smoke was emitting from every single floor.
Blocks away, the FBI's Neil Herman realizes this is no ordinary explosion. As Sunday stretches into Monday and on into Tuesday, there are no other leads to the bombers. It's now a full 5 days since the blast. The trains at the World Trade Center are up and running, but still no real trace of the terrorists. FBI Special Agent Jamie Cedeno, an auto crimes expert, is called in and takes a look at the rubbing made of the encrypted dots found by Sadawi and Hanlon.
When I looked at it, I knew immediately that we had a confidential VIN derivative sitting right there on that piece of paper.
Cedeno immediately runs the number through the National Insurance Crime Bureau database. The NICB keeps a record of all cars manufactured and documents if someone has reported a vehicle stolen.
Next thing you know, we've got registration information on a Ford van reported stolen at Jersey City PD on February 26th. I said, this is it.
The FBI then traces the van's registration to a rider rental agency in New Jersey. The van was the same vehicle rented and reported stolen by Mohammed Salame. The next day, Salame arrives at the rental office in New Jersey to pick up his $400 deposit on the van. When he arrives, an agent greets Salame from behind the desk. But he is not a rider agent. He's an undercover agent with the FBI. Dozens of other agents are hiding everywhere, on the rooftops, behind trees, and in unmarked vans. The building is surrounded.
There was a tremendous surveillance in place. There was a decision, a tactical decision made to apprehend him as soon as he came outside.
FBI agents arrest Salome as he leaves the Ryder office, 6 days after a bomb tore apart the World Trade Center. Investigators are determined more than ever to find Salome's accomplices. Less than a month after the bombing of the World Trade Center in New York, 4 Islamic terrorists have been arrested. Mohammed Salome, the man who'd rented the van and driven the getaway car, Nidal Ayad, Ahmad Ajah, and Mahmoud Abu Halima. All 4 alleged conspirators are charged with the destruction of buildings by means of explosives causing death. The charges carry up to life sentences. A year to the day after the first arrest and the bombing, the jury reaches its verdict. All 4 defendants guilty on all counts. Judge Kevin Duffy sentences each bomber to a 240-year prison term. In 1995, 2 more terrorists are arrested. Ramzi Youssef and Iyad Ismail, the 2 men who had originally driven the Ryder truck. In 1997, they are also found guilty of conspiring to blow up the World Trade Center. Each is sentenced to life in prison. The bombers were all followers of Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman, a spiritual leader of a fundamentalist Muslim group based in New Jersey. The Sheikh, who has been linked to Osama bin Laden, was convicted in a separate case for sedition and sentenced to life in prison in 1996.
Nosair was brought to this holding cell in Lower Manhattan after his arrest. By then, detectives had searched his apartment and found 47 boxes full of personal possessions and papers. But investigators dismissed those papers as irrelevant religious materials. It was only after the bombing of the World Trade Center that law enforcement re-examined those papers and realized they had overlooked one of the largest collections of terrorist materials ever found in the United States. The papers included plans to blow up American skyscrapers. The documents would reveal that Nosair was at the heart of a worldwide terrorist network headquartered right here in the United States.
Unfortunately, we had that information. It was there, and we didn't see it.
Michael Cherkasky was the chief of investigations for the Manhattan District Attorney at the time of the bombing.
And looking back at it, there was enormous amounts of significant material in those boxes. Whether they were the precise plans, no, I don't think so, but were there very strong indications that this man and a group of compatriots were involved in terrorist activities which could ultimately lead to a disaster like the World Trade Center? The answer is yes. Only when we started looking at that material and we started finding things and seeing things clearly for the first time that we became agitated because, honestly, because we hadn't seen it before, and excited because, in fact, we now thought we had more of a clue about tracing the history of this group and more of an idea about what had actually happened here.
The FBI claims they did not examine the documents Nosair had until after the World Trade Center bombing. It is not credible to argue that law enforcement would not read the documents they seized from a murder suspect. And in fact, I have proof that law enforcement did read Nosair's documents right after they seized them. A little over a week after Nosair murdered Kahane, the New York Times ran a story called FBI Investigates Groups of Zealots Who Praise Kahane's Slaying. Let's read the first 2 paragraphs from that story. The Federal Bureau of Investigation is scrambling to investigate the Muslim groups associated with the Masjid al-Salam Mosque in Jersey City, where al-Said Nosair, the man accused of killing Rabbi Meir Kahane, worshipped, according to high-level law enforcement officials. Although the New York City police say they believe Mr. Nosair acted alone, one law enforcement official said the investigation into Rabbi Meir Kahane's death had opened a window into several radical fundamentalist groups. Besides looking at possible links between these groups and the shooting of Rabbi Kahane last week at a Manhattan hotel, the FBI fears that these groups may be capable of terrorist activities at a time of heightened tensions in the Middle East, the high-level officials said. A little over a week after the New York Times said the arrest of Nasser had opened a window to several extremist Islamic groups, the FBI publicly contradicted that story. There is no evidence that Mr. Nasser is linked to any Mideast terrorist organization, District Attorney Robert M. Morgenthau said in announcing the indictment. Given the story that the Times published a week ago, this statement is ridiculous. So why did he make it? Why does the FBI insist that they did not read Nasser's documents when they obviously did? The CIA must have told the FBI to drop their investigation. The CIA did not want the FBI to destroy their terrorism network, which was now Al-Qaeda. This article proves that the government read Nasser's documents soon after the Kahane murder. The New York Times published this article about a month after the murder. If you look at the bottom of page 1 of this article, you will see Nasser's home also contained literature relating to guns, weapons and combat, including subjects such as bomb making, hand grenades, security and listening devices, arms in Afghanistan, explosive traps, how to teach yourself to shoot like an expert, the 9 don'ts of fighting discipline, and the guide to buying guns and ammunition. There were also files of articles about the assassination of Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and the attempt on Zaki Badr, the Egyptian Interior Minister. Clearly these documents are not irrelevant religious material. Clearly the FBI did examine the documents Nasser had in his apartment when he murdered Kahane. Or how else did the New York Times get a list of those documents? Is the FBI claiming that, hey, we did not look at these documents, but the New York Times did, and we don't read the New York Times, so we did not know that Nasser had this material. And notice that one document was called Arms in Afghanistan. Presumably, Nasser was given this document because he was involved in the war to oust the Soviets from Afghanistan. Again, that effort was run by the CIA. The fact that he had that document while living in America tends to show that he was working with the CIA. Now let's see what Emerson claims was in those boxes.
The boxes included formulas for bomb making, detailed instructions on attacking aircraft, assassination targets, and even classified U.S. military documents.
Presumably, the CIA gave him those classified U.S. military documents. Perhaps Arms in Afghanistan was one of those classified U.S. military documents. Again, the war to oust the Soviets from Afghanistan was a CIA operation. The fact that Nasser had these documents implies that he was working with the CIA to remove the Soviets from Afghanistan. Amazingly, Nasser continued to work for Al-Qaeda while he was in prison, and the U.S. government let him. This proves that our government wanted Nasser to carry out his acts of terrorism.
From his prison cell, Nasser continued to organize the campaign of terror. Prison logs show that he met with several of the conspirators to help plan the World Trade Center bombing.
So after not stopping Nasser from killing Kahane, the government allows him to organize the attack on the World Trade Center from jail. Somehow, the prison, which should be monitoring his communications with the outside world, just missed that part.
He was a soldier when he shot Kahane, and in some ways his status was elevated to be a soldier, a trainer, an example, a martyr for the movement, who was allegedly continually demanding that the movement move forward, that they take more strident action, that he was sitting in jail for what he had done, and that others had to pick up the mantle.
So while Nasser is urging his followers to kill more people, the prison officials, who should be monitoring these conversations, are doing what? Apparently, they were monitoring these conversations because the FBI did indeed have Mohammed Salameh under surveillance before he attacked the World Trade Center. The FBI began monitoring him after he visited al-Said Nasser in prison. The FBI sought to electronically eavesdrop on conversations in prison between al-Said Nasser, who was serving time in Attica State Prison in connection with the slaying of Rabbi Kahane, and Mohammed Salameh. Whether tape recordings were made was something officials refused to confirm yesterday. The FBI probably didn't want to acknowledge the existence of the tapes because Nasser and Salameh probably discussed the attack on the World Trade Center. If the FBI said they had tapes which suggested that Salameh was going to bomb the World Trade Center, people would wonder why the FBI didn't stop the attack. Of course, the mere fact that the FBI had Salameh under surveillance before the attack shows that the FBI knew the attack was coming. And Salome wasn't the only World Trade Center bomber who visited Nasser in jail. Many of the suspects were also fervent supporters of El-Sayed Nasser. They showed up at Mr. Nasser's trial and have visited him at Attica State Prison. You would think that the FBI would be monitoring these people. And indeed they were. 5 months before the World Trade Center bombing, about 20 members of the 2 mosques in Brooklyn and Jersey City, where several Trade Center suspects worshipped, were subpoenaed to appear before a federal grand jury. The subpoenas, issued to people who had visited El-Sayed Nasser in prison or attended his trial, indicates that federal agents had been pressing harder than was previously known to make inroads into the small emigre world from which the Trade Center suspects came. Actually, FBI surveillance of the terrorists goes back much further than that. The FBI had photographed the terrorists in 1989, 4 years before the bombing of the World Trade Center. James B. Fogel, an FBI agent, said he photographed several suspects as they came in and out of a mosque at 552 Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn on July 2, 1989. The mosque at that address is Masjid al-Farouk. He and other agents then followed the men as they drove to the Calverton shooting range near Riverhead, Long Island, where Mr. Fogel photographed them firing what he said were AK-47 assault rifles and 9mm semi-automatic pistols at targets. Obviously, the government wanted to keep tabs on their assets. And not only did the FBI have the terrorists under surveillance before the bombing, they also had an informer who had infiltrated the group. Court papers filed in connection with the World Trade Center bombing say for the first time that a confidential informer provided information to investigators about the activities of Mohammed A. Salome, the first suspect arrested in the February 26th explosion. The informer was said to have helped Mr. Salome learn to drive a van approximately 2 days before the World Trade Center explosion. The informant, Imad A. Salam, was working for the Federal Bureau of Investigation since at least November 1991. The revelation that Mr. Salam was in contact with the federal government that long ago raises new questions about why the FBI was unaware of the plot to bomb the World Trade Center on February 26th. Amazingly, Imad Salam apparently taped the conversations he had with his FBI handlers. And in those tapes, you can hear Salam say that he warned the FBI of the World Trade Center bombing before it happened. And you can hear the FBI agent apparently agreeing with Salam.
Correspondent Jacqueline Adams has the story.
FBI agents might have been able to prevent last February's deadly explosion at New York's World Trade Center. They discussed secretly substituting harmless powder for the explosives, but they didn't, according to the FBI's own informant, Imad Salam. Unbeknownst to the FBI at the time, Salam recorded many of his conversations with his handlers. In one, Salam complains to an FBI agent, "Since the bomb went off, I feel terrible. I feel bad. I feel here is people who don't listen." The agent replies, "Hey, I mean, it wasn't like you didn't try and I didn't try. You can't force people to do the right thing."
At another point in their conversation, Salam said, "You were informed. Everything is ready. The day and the time. Boom. Lock them up and that's that. That's why I feel so bad." Other people confirmed that Salam had warned the FBI in advance. Barbara Rogers, the former wife of the informer Imad Salam, said the day after the explosion, Mr. Salam was upset and told her the bombing could have been averted if the FBI had heeded his warnings. He had told the agency that several buildings had been targeted, she said, and he gave them names of several men, including Mahmoud Abu Halima and Ibrahim El-Grabrowni, who were later arrested in the case. One of those 2 men, Mahmoud Abu Halima, was convicted of bombing the World Trade Center and was sentenced to 240 years in prison. The story of his life is pretty interesting. Mahmoud Abu Halima was one of the people recruited at the Al-Khifa Refugee Center in Brooklyn. He was known as one of the committed. Several times, his acquaintances say, he left his home to go fight for months at a time, with the rebels trying to topple the Soviet-installed government in Afghanistan. Abu Halima came to America on October 4th, 1986, with a German passport and a tourist visa. According to the New York Times, he overstayed his visa by 5 years, and it was not clear how he left and re-entered the country to go to Pakistan. Not clear how he left and re-entered the country? Let me guess. The CIA told immigration to give him a special exemption to enter and leave the country. While living in America, he worked as a cab driver. Nevertheless, Abu Halima became a permanent resident under a special exemption in the 1986 Immigration Reform Act, under which he claimed an exemption as an agricultural worker. How did Abu Halima get an exemption as an agricultural worker when he was a cab driver who overstayed his tourist visa by 5 years? Let me take another guess. Same answer. The CIA told immigration to make him a permanent resident. So the guy who the CIA presumably helped enter and leave the country on multiple occasions, using a tourist visa for 5 years too long, which allowed him to obtain permanent residency under a special exemption for agricultural workers when he was really a cab driver. That guy helped detonate a bomb at the World Trade Center. And the CIA didn't know about it? I don't think so. Not only did the U.S. government know about the World Trade Center terrorist network in Brooklyn, the Egyptian government also knew about that terrorist network. And they warned us about that terrorist network before the bombing. President Hosni Mubarak of Egypt said today that America could have prevented the bombing of the World Trade Center if American officials had heeded his warnings about an Islamic fundamentalist network in the United States. You may be asking yourself, why did the CIA have Al-Qaeda detonate a bomb inside the World Trade Center? There were several reasons. Here's one. The CIA used the bombing as an excuse to lash out at other governments. Throughout the investigation, the New York Times would hint at foreign involvement in the plot. Presumably, whenever the CIA wanted an excuse to lash out at this or that government, they would leak a story to the New York Times which hinted at that country's involvement in the bombing. In the immediate aftermath of the bombing, however, the government told the Times that there was no foreign involvement. More and more, one leading law enforcement official said, the bombing is seen as an act by ill-trained New York area plotters operating independently and without direct orders from a foreign government or international terrorist network. But he cautioned that this view could change as the investigation progressed. The New York Times printed this article on March 26th. A month later, the New York Times was singing a different tune. On April 25th, the Times said, signs are mounting that the attack was part of a wide conspiracy that involved huge payments from abroad. The U.S. government traced this money to Iran and Germany. This case has some fascinating turns coming up in it, said one law enforcement official. There's some real surprises in there. It'll be a bigger show before it's over. One of the countries we apparently wanted to pressure was Iraq. Shortly after the attack, the New York Times reported that Ramzi Youssef, the person who organized the attack, had Iraqi parents, which suggested that Iraq might somehow be involved in the attack. Investigators are examining whether the World Trade Center bombing could have some relation to Iraq. Their interest was sparked by a missing Iraqi, Ramzi Ahmed Youssef, who came to America last September on a flight from Pakistan and disappeared after the bombing. However, the information about Youssef's parents seems not to be true. In fact, the consensus now seems to be that his parents were Pakistani. But presumably, the U.S. government lied about his parents so they could implicate Iraq in the bombing. And there was another apparent connection to Iraq. According to the New York Times, the FBI claimed that two brothers who gave crucial information about the bombing may have fled to Iraq. Presumably, the U.S. government sent those informers to Iraq so they would have an excuse to pressure the Iraqi government. And after the bombing, in their comments to the New York Times, government officials did imply that Iraq was behind the bombing. The fact that both suspects are believed to have fled to Iraq has intrigued investigators who are trying to determine whether a foreign government was behind the attack. One of the brothers who fled to Iraq was Abdul Rahman Yassin. He had been questioned by the FBI and released almost immediately after the bombing of the World Trade Center. Apparently, releasing him wasn't such a great idea, because on August 4th, the government indicted him in connection with the attack. The government accused him of helping to mix explosive chemicals in the month leading up to the bombing. The lawyers for the other suspects were incredulous that the government had allowed Yasin to leave the country. The issue is, why was he allowed to go, considering the information they had after the bombing, said one of the lawyers for the defense. They knew he would go to a country with no relations with the United States, making his return an impossibility. That man knew more than anybody, and that's the man they allowed to leave. Not too long after the bombing, the neocons began blaming Iraq. Lori Milroy led the charge. She wrote a series of articles and books about the connection between Saddam Hussein and the terrorists behind the World Trade Center bombing. Not surprisingly, former CIA Director James Woolsey was a big supporter of Milroy. He wrote the foreword for one of her books. The subtitle of that book was The First World Trade Center Attack and Saddam Hussein's War Against America. In the foreword, Woolsey called the book brave and lucid. Regardless of whether Yusuf was Iraqi or Pakistani, he was certainly an asset of Western intelligence agencies. I won't say that he was solely an asset of the CIA, however, because he was apparently educated in Britain, which implies that he was actually their asset to begin with. In any event, in the wake of the bombing, we showed everyone that Yusuf was working for us. Why else would we bungle the effort to arrest him? We bungled the search for Yusuf in several ways. To begin with, our government failed to offer a reward for his capture in the immediate aftermath of the bombing. The State Department and the FBI engaged in a game of kabuki. The State Department blamed the FBI for not offering the reward. A State Department spokesman, Michael McCurry, acknowledged that the department had denied a request by the FBI in early April for the State Department to provide a substantial reward in the case. Another State Department official said the department had since made plain that it believed the FBI should provide the reward, and that it had the money to do so. So, in other words, the FBI said the State Department should pony up the money for the reward. The State Department said the FBI should come up with the money. And while both sides blamed each other, nothing got done. Rather than bureaucratic incompetence, this was bureaucratic kabuki, the purpose of which was to allow Yusuf to remain free. In fact, one congressman essentially admitted that the whole thing was kabuki, and that the government did not want to offer a reward. Representative Olympia J. Snowe, Republican of Maine, said they could solve it if they really wanted to. And because the U.S. government failed to promptly offer a reward for the capture of Yusuf, American officials say privately that they fear the United States may have squandered a crucial chance to track down Mr. Yusuf before he disappeared in the Middle East. In fact, refusing to set a reward for Yusuf's capture was not the only thing the government screwed up. After he was first identified as a suspect in the case on March 31st, FBI officials said they would move swiftly to add him to its most wanted list. But it was not until April 19th that the FBI could decide whose place on that list Mr. Yusuf should take. And here's another reason why we had Al-Qaeda bomb the World Trade Center. We wanted an excuse to demand that Pakistan crack down on an air route which was used to smuggle in undocumented aliens. Two of the bombers, Ahmed Ajaj and Ramzi Youssef, used this air route to travel to America. According to the New York Times, this air route had become so notorious for bringing undocumented aliens into New York that American officials said they suspected official Pakistani complicity. Of course, after it was learned that those two terrorists used that air route, the American government proceeded to threaten the Pakistani government, and the Pakistani government took action. Their action produced a sharp drop in the numbers of inadmissible aliens disembarking from Pakistani International Airlines flights in April, and so far this month. We've seen a dramatic turnaround, a dramatic improvement, said one U.S. official. And here's the final reason why we had Al-Qaeda bomb the World Trade Center. We needed an excuse to make those Muslims our enemy. Until the bombing, those Muslims were our friends. They helped us defeat the Soviets in Afghanistan. But after the Soviets left, we did not want them to be our allies anymore. So we needed an excuse to make them our enemy. The bombing did that.